guys, new PowerPoint alert, AP Psychology. This one goes out to you guys. All right, so getting into some of the first unit information, a little bit about the history of psych and some of the approaches, but not too much. You can kind of look that up on your own later. I don't think the FRQs are really going to talk about it. The main thing that we are going to get into are the research methods. So again, just kind of the approaches, behavioralism, being able to observe behaviors, being able to condition and get into how people learn, the observable behaviors, trying to make it more scientific because again, in psychology, you're not able to study what's actually being thought about. You can study the observed behaviors. Then you get into humanistic psychology with Carl Rogers, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And when it comes time, I'll make sure that I do go over the information for motivation, stress, emotion, and personality too. So don't think that I won't go through a PowerPoint for that section as well. All right, one of the big questions in psych that we get into in the beginning, just in the introductory phase, is this idea of nature versus nurture. We did talk about this, and nature being your biology and your genetics versus nurture, your experiences. And so it's that kind of combination, or what's going to lead you to be who you are. Is it just your nature, or is it your environment and how you've been nurtured, or how much of it is both? All right, psychology's three main levels of analysis. We have the biological, the psychological, and then the socio-cultural, which gives us the biopsychosocial approach. So you have all of these different influences that impact a person's behavior or mental processes. So just to quickly read through it, you have your biological influences, natural selection, adaptive traits, genetic predispositions, brain mechanisms, and your hormones. So you then go into your psychological influences, learned fears, other learned expectations, things that could be cultural, things that are, unique to maybe your family, emotional responses, and your cognitive processing and perceptual interpretation. So how you're perceiving the world. Sociocultural influences, again, these are all kind of interconnected in a lot of ways too, which is why that's not a standalone method of analysis. But lastly, the sociocultural influences the presence of others, because being around other people does influence how we behave. Cultural, societal, and familial expectations, so the expectations your family might have on you, maybe a job, college, life, who you're dating, peer and other group influences, and compelling models such as the media, magazines, social media, Instagram. So just to be a little bit more, definitive here about those different approaches, I'm not going to read through all of these. They are in the PowerPoint in the Microsoft Team folder that is labeled Unit 1. Actually a longer version of this PowerPoint is actually updated or uploaded into that section. But again, you have the different approaches in psych: biological, evolutionary, psychodynamic, behavioral, cognitive, humanistic, and sociocultural. Now, what does this mean for research? Well, depending on the approach that you as a psychologist want to take, you're going to probably do your research in different ways. Rather than doing a survey or a controlled study, if you're in the behavioral section, you might do a naturalistic observation in order to understand how people interact, right? You want to see them in their natural environment. We also have cognitive, humanistic, and sociocultural. So, research, scientific observation, a systematic empirical investigation that is structured to answer questions about the world. Research method, systematic approach to answering those scientific questions. So, correlations, you have a scatter plot, and then you'll have a chart, and eventually you'll have a correlation coefficient. We went through this stuff in the very beginning of the year, so that's why we need to go over it again. So what do correlations tell us? That there is an existence of a consistent, systematic relationship between two events, measures, or variables. So you could have a perfect positive correlation, which would be 1.0. right? Every time one thing increases, the other thing increases. So you could say, every time I add a 5-pound weight to the scale, the weight's going to increase. So as I increase the number of weights, the measurement on the actual scale will also increase. There you would have a perfect positive correlation, unless your scale's broken. Something that has no relationship is 0.0, your scatter plot, your dots are going to be all over the place because there's really no relationship between those two variables. So it's 0.0. Perfect negative correlation is just going to have a negative slope. It's not that it's a bad thing or anything like that. It's just that the slope is pointing down. So, scatter plot of a person's height and their temperament, right? Are they moody? Your height and your temperament, could you maybe, if you had a line of, if you put your line in there, would you actually be able to see something? Maybe, but there are a lot of outliers here. You're not really going to see something for that. When we do see it, your positive correlation, again, is going to increase in one measure or matched by increases in another measure. Example, sleep and nutrition. That's going to, as you increase those, your grades are going to increase. A negative correlation, again, an increase in one measure are matched by decreases in the other. The more miles I run, my weight in pounds is going to decrease, right? So again, it's not that it's a bad thing. There's a strong correlation. The only reason it's called negative is because it has a negative slope. It's pointing down. So coefficient of the correlation, statistical index ranging from -1 to +1. Regardless if it's negative or positive, the closer it is to that 1, the stronger the relationship. The closer it is to 0, whether positive or negative, demonstrate that there's no relation between the variables. Okay? Are we good? I hope so. Please ask questions. Obviously not now, but during office hours if you have a question. Correlation and causation. Correlation does not demonstrate causation. Just because two variables are related does not mean that the one causes the other to occur. Okay? Somebody might run miles all day, every day. Let's say I run 5 miles every other day. Eventually, am I going to keep losing weight? No, because at a certain point, I'm going to stop losing weight because I'm going to continue eating or I'll increase my eating. There's a whole lot of other variables, but just because I'm running does not mean that I'm going to continue to lose weight. So running does not cause weight loss. Is it a factor of it? Yes. Is it a, strong factor of it? Absolutely, but it's not the only factor, right? I might be running more miles, but what if my I don't know, Sarah's candy bar intake increases, right? Because you guys know I love buying the Sarah's candies. So again, there's a lot of variables that you have to take into consideration, but again, correlation does not equal causation. All right, methods of research and data collection. So again, we kind of talked about some of this. You have naturalistic observation, surveys, clinical, and experiments. Naturalistic observation, you are watching people, observing a person or an animal in the environment in which the person or animal lives. You're not manipulating anything, you're not controlling anything, you're not setting anything up. You're literally just like people watching, or you're at the zoo. Well, I guess not the zoo, but you're trying to watch them in their natural observation or natural environment. So the limits of this, though, is that you have the observer effect. Changes in a subject's behavior caused by an awareness of being observed. Well, let's say you are watching a group of teachers interact with students, and then all of a sudden the teachers become aware. What are they going to do? They might change their behavior. I'm pretty sure that you've seen your teachers being observed by their principal, and all of a sudden that teacher's body language and voice or enthusiasm, it changes. All right? It's not necessarily that they're being fake, but it's just about, oh my gosh, I'm being watched. Let me change to how I think they want me to act. Then you have what's known as the observer bias. And this occurs when observers see what they expect to see and record only those selected details. So this is a little bit dangerous. Again, I'm going to use a teacher observation as an example, because if there's certain things that are known about me that I do well, that I don't do well, they might, kind of focus in on some of those things because they might have a bit of a bias for my positives or negatives, right? The last thing is anthropomorphic error, attributing human thoughts, feelings, or motives to animals, especially as a way of explaining their behavior. My cat is acting like that because she's feeling depressed today. No, she's a cat. You can't diagnose cats with clinical depression. We try to make them more human. We try to describe their behaviors as human. And it's because of our want to elevate animals, and it's not that they don't care or that they don't have some sort of feelings, but obviously as humans, we can't, nor should we, attribute our thoughts and feelings and motives to animals. All right, the next one, survey method, using public polling techniques to answer psychological questions. So this is where you get a survey in a mail, and it's a small group that's going to try and reflect the larger population. Going on down here, it says population, entire group of animals or people are belonging to a particular category, all married women, or all teenagers in Pittsburgh. The next thing that you end up running into with a survey, and this is the downside of it, is that you have what's known as the courtesy bias. When people are answering psychological questions or answering questions on a survey, again, they're going to try and give what's the socially acceptable answers, trying to seem more polite. Especially if the survey is not anonymous or if it's like a face-to-face interview type survey or something like that. Again, people will in a way have that kind of, observer bias in a sense because they're trying to be what they think they should be versus who they are. Clinical method. You can have a case study, which is just one person, in-depth focus of that single subject. Then you can also have natural clinical tests, natural events such as accidents that end up providing psychological data. If you haven't already, you can look up the strange case of Phineas Gage, I think it is. He had a railroad spike end up going through his skull and he lived. And that's, a test in which these events, accidents ended up providing us a lot of psychological data about the brain, how it works, what ended up happening to him, what was his brain damage like. It changed his personality, changed his mood. So it can be really illuminating. And even though it's an accident, sometimes it's horrific, it can at least provide information. Experiments, a formal trial to confirm or disconfirm a hypothesis and to identify cause and effect relationships. So say you have a theory, you want to test it out, you create an experiment, and you get your data back. And then you have to rerun the experiment over and over again to make sure that it's valid, right? So experimentation, you run it through the scientific method. You observe, define a problem, propose your hypothesis, gather evidence or test your hypothesis, and then you would publish your results to build upon a theory. So your hypothesis, is a predictable outcome of an experiment or an educated guess about the relationship between variables. Your operational definition, this is important, states the exact procedures used to represent a concept. It's your limitations within your study. So if I wanted to gauge depression amongst students, I would have to give an operational definition about what depression actually is in this situation, so then I can accurately measure it, and so that there wouldn't be confusion amongst the participants about what the depression is that I'm trying to measure. That would be my operational definition. So, example again, depression for my survey would be that 5 out of 7 days a week you're, having a crying fit. That would be on a scale of 1 to 10. 10, if you're crying 5 days a week out of 7, you're depressed. If it's 4 days, 3 days, 2 days, 1 day, that way the survey participants would understand and my experiment would be able to kind of go through it, right? I'd be able to test that theory. Maybe not through a survey because that's not really an experiment, but just trying to give you an understanding of operational definition, not necessarily in the experimentation aspect, so I apologize if you're confused. Performing an experiment. Directly vary a condition you might think affects behavior. Create 2 or more groups of subjects alike in all ways except the condition that you are varying. Record whether varying the condition has any effect on behavior. So if I wanted to do this depression in students experiment, where the condition or the operational condition is that definition, is that you're crying 5 out of 7 days a week and you're depressed. So then I put you into my severely depressed group and then my not severely depressed group. What I could do then for my experiment is control things like sleep, right? Maybe in my not so severely depressed group, I would interrupt their sleep and then again give them the survey to see at the end of a 2-week time period with lack of consistent sleep, what is your depression like? Now, obviously, that would be a really cruel experiment to perform, but again, I'm just trying to connect the concept of your operational definition and you're performing an experiment. So I would be controlling the participants' sleep, right? Does that have an effect on their behaviors? Are they crying more or less? Obviously, I think they'd probably be crying more, but again, just, I'm kind of creating these as I go, and we're creating these examples as I go. So sometimes, kind of making them on the fly. I don't want to be too confusing to you guys, so I apologize if I am. All right, variables. So don't let this confuse you. Any condition that can change and that might affect the outcome of an experiment. You have your independent variable. Conditions altered by the experimenter, aka sleep disruptions. These are suspected causes for behavioral differences. So I'm controlling and I'm manipulating how much sleep my participants are getting in a single night. Turning on lights, having the fire alarm going off, right? I'm constantly interrupting their sleep during this 2-week, imagination or this made up experiment that I'm running. What the dependent variable is what I'm trying to measure for the results of my experiment. The condition, the depression that is now affected by the amount of sleep that they are or are not getting. So the independent variable is what you're manipulating. The dependent variable is what you're measuring. Independent, manipulating. Dependent, measuring. So then you'll have different groups. Your experimental group is the group of subjects that gets the independent variable, their messed up sleep. Your control group is the group of subjects that does not get the independent variable. Then you have random assignment, subject that has an equal chance of being in either group. All right, memory experiment. Will hours slept increase students' memory test? Independent variable, hours slept. Group 1 will wake up with alarm every 2 hours. Group 2 every 4 hours. Group 3 every 8 hours. Group 4 control group, no alarm. So the dependent variable, performance on a memory test. We record the data, scores on a memory test, then plot and report our results to see if there's a correlation. One of the things that we cannot really always account for are extraneous variables, conditions that a researcher wants to prevent from affecting the outcomes of the experiment. Example, number of hours slept before the experiment, especially for people in the control group, right? If they only slept 2 hours, that's really going to mess with your data. A placebo is a fake pill, sugar, or injection. The placebo effect changes in behavior that result from expectations that a drug or other treatment will have some effect. The belief that you have taken the active drug when you haven't. Experiment types, you have your single blind and then double blind. Single blind is when the subjects, the people in the experiment, don't know who's in, they don't know if they're in the experimental or control group, but the facilitators do know who's in which group. Double blind is when the subjects and the experimenters, the facilitators of the experiment, neither has any idea who's in which group. The best type of experiment is the double blind. That way you don't have any bias. Experimenter effects. Changes in the subject behavior caused by the unintended influence of the experimenter's actions. And this is why double blind is better, because you don't want to have the experimenter kind of either body language, cueing people in, asking more questions, maybe focusing in on people, whatever it might be. You don't want to have any bias in that. You can also have self-fulfilling prophecy, a prediction that leads people to act in ways to make the prediction come true. We think we talked about this with like astrology and stuff like that in class before. Oh, I'm a Taurus, so I'm like this, or I'm a Sagittarius, I'm a Capricorn, so I like black clothing and black shoes, whatever, you know. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, look at me, I have all this black clothes, I must be a Capricorn, true. No, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's entertainment, you can have fun with it, but at the end of the day, people do like to kind of fall into these kind of comforting categories, like, oh, I knew that was going to happen. So how do you assess an experiment? This is going to be extremely important for the FRQ on the exam. You might have to talk about the data. Is it reliable? To what extent did their test or their experiment yield consistent results? You might have to look at standard deviations. You might have to look at a bar graph. Do they talk about whether or not they've retested in the scenario? And then they might also ask you about validity, the extent to which a test measures or predicts what it is supposed to. They might ask you to assess the researcher's validity, on whether or not their results are true. And so you have to say, I don't believe or I agree that their experiment or their survey is valid, and then explain why. So we did this already with the first FRQ in the packets. We did it in the beginning of the school year. So again, just getting used to asserting yourself in your writing by using the language that we have here. So how do we quantify these experiments? How do we find an average common correlated behavior? And then how do we identify what's abnormal or what are our outliers? I'm going to do the math, but it is math. It's statistics. So you have your mode, your mean, and your median. The mode is the most frequently occurring score in the distribution. Most kids in the class scored an 80 on the test, right? The most frequently occurring score, an 80. Your mean is your arithmetic average of that distribution of all 25 kids in the class. You add them up and then you divide. Obtained by adding the scores and then dividing by the number of scores. That is your mean score. The median is the middle score in a distribution. Half of them are above and half are below. So, again, we're not going to be doing the math, but just understanding where these numbers are coming from could be beneficial for your FRQ. So oh my gosh, you guys, I'm not used to talking anymore. I'm sorry. Taking a look at the curve. This is an intelligence test. Again, you're going to see a bell curve. You have your outliers on the outside, and then where most people are falling in, right? So just kind of getting used to looking at the mathematics of it all. But I hope they don't give you this. All right, statistical reasoning. Your range is the difference between the highest and the lowest. So if my top score was a 92 and my lowest score was a 56, that's the range. That is your difference between the highest and lowest scores in that class, or AKA that distribution. Then you have your standard deviation, which we try to practice in the beginning of the year. This is your computed measure of how much scores vary around the mean. This is where we were taking the square root and all that extra math stuff. Ask Mr. Wehar. Statistical significance, a statistical statement of how likely it is that an obtained result occurred by chance. And this is why we have to run experiments over and over and over again, because we need to make sure that the numbers and these data-driven findings are actually appropriate. Because if it's by chance and it's not real, it was an accident, then there is no statistical significance unless you can replicate this data. Guys, that's pretty much it for the rest of this unit. Research methods on psych. Again, if you guys have questions or you need something to follow up with, just feel free to send a text via Teams, send an email, post in the the Microsoft Teams page, whatever it is that you can, reach me. Doesn't matter. If I don't get to you tonight, I'll get to you the next day. The outline is due today for Unit 1, and the FRQ practice is due on Wednesday. Just keep listening. I know that these aren't the most exciting videos. I am working on making more entertaining ones. Not that you guys need to be entertained. That's why you have your social media and Netflix, etc. But at the same time, I want to make sure that you guys stay engaged and are doing the work with integrity and attention to detail. So that's it, and I'll see you guys when I'm looking at you. Bye.